Hi there. This is Chris Van Orden with Napa County Probation, and welcome to the Challenges of Parenting Through Trauma. This training started out as a live offering for resource families in the county. Um, we then converted it into a YouTube format. Given all the challenges of COVID, we really wanted to make it possible for our families to have a training that they can utilize while they're sheltering in place. It's important to know that this is a YouTube training, so we really wanted to design this so you could stop and play kind of at your will. We know you're very busy, you got a lot of responsibilities and a lot of things to take care of in the home. So feel free to take your time with this training, feel free to pause, come back to it later. We're really going to try and make it so the training flows in a way that you're able to do that. So here we go. Thank you for being a part of this. So, who am I? My name is Chris Van Orden. I work with the Napa County Probation Department. Um, I've worked here for around 12 years, mostly in the juvenile division. As you would imagine, we deal with trauma a lot here with the youth that we have coming into our juvenile hall and the youth that we work with in the community. Um, I also am lucky enough in my current assignment to work with the resource family team over at Child Welfare. We partner child welfare, probation, and expressions of hope, as well as Lilliput. A lot of organizations we're partnering with to provide a positive experience, or we hope to provide a positive experience for resource families in the community. So it was really something that we thought of, especially with trainings. I know it's very hard to with your busy schedule to get your training hours. So we on the resource family team hope this is informative and hope it's helpful to you. Um, I'm not an expert by any means in this field. I don't have PhD or anything like that in the subject. I do deal with youth and trauma a lot, as I said. But what I did hope to do is to give you a format where a lot of information is available to you in an easy and accessible way. So that's really what we're going for here. This is an important topic and an important subject. So we really want to make this as easy and as accessible as possible to you. That being said, if there's any suggestions you guys have for future trainings, anything that we can make easier to you, please let us know. I'm going to make sure my emails attached at the end of this and in the description on the YouTube window will have other contact information as well. So please reach out to us. Let us know how we can make your lives easier, how we can support you. You guys are our heroes. That's not an understatement. I'm going to probably say that multiple times. I'll annoy you with it throughout the training, but we really do appreciate what it is that you're doing. You make these kids' lives better. For kids that have already been through trauma, as you're going to see in this training, having one person that loves them and care about them, it makes all the difference. And I see it with kids that come into our hall and kids that I deal with. You could tell the difference between a kid who's really been through a lot and then a youth who has been also through a lot, but also who has people out there that really care about and support him or her. It makes a huge difference, and you guys are really doing the heavy lifting. So we really appreciate it. One of the things when I started researching this training was I started Googling about COVID, and I noticed the correlation between, our pandemic that we're all going through and mental health. Obviously, we're all dealing with mental health issues as we enter into a very unprecedented time. As we can imagine, our youth also deal with these issues quite a bit. And it really is important to understand that you all, having so much responsibility normally in your day to day, but also having so much responsibility now in this world, you guys are going through quite a bit. So, what I did in the next part of this presentation is I inserted a 5-minute breathing exercise. That's what we're going to be doing next. I think it's important to manage your own wellness, and this is just a little bit of that if we could. Now, this is a YouTube presentation, of course, so you can fast forward through this. It's not a requirement, but I do think it's nice, especially for people like you who really take on a heavy load here, to take 5 minutes and to breathe and to feel yourself breathing and to just really be conscious of it and work on wellness. So that's why I inserted this in here because, again, and this is something that comes up a lot in this training, that you aren't positioned to help youth through trauma if you're going through trauma and having a hard time dealing with your own trauma. It makes it very difficult. So I thought this would be helpful. During the next video here that's going to pop up, what you're going to see and hear is some music coming up, and what you're going to practice, if you would, is breathing in with the music and then breathing out with the music, and letting it guide your breathing that way. There's also a visual aid that sort of escalates as we breathe in and then de-escalates as we breathe out. So let's give it a try here. So I hope that was helpful for you, and I hope you had some time to relax there, and just breathe. There's a lot of really cool videos on wellness on YouTube, and I encourage you to kind of take some time for yourself and explore that. A lot of cool yoga stuff that I found on there. Um, you guys deserve some time out for yourselves too, and we really want to be helpful to you there because that is so important for you. Another thing that is important in trauma is discussing Maslow. If you guys aren't familiar, Maslow was a psychologist who came up with the hierarchy of needs. I really love this concept because it's very graspable to everyone. It's really helped me in conceptualizing what our kids go through and kind of some of the stuff we're seeing. As you can see on the pyramid here, the lowest level of this pyramid that Maslow discusses is physiological. He surmises that if a youth has uh, physiological needs met, that the brain can move up to more complex um, systems of needs, and that so basically, if a kid is has food, water, and sleep, very base level needs, then you move on to the next stage of brain development, which is uh, getting the needs met around safety. Um, it's things like employment, security, places to sleep, like a home, health, general health. Um, it's his belief that once we achieve that, then we can move on to love and belonging. But I want to stay there for a moment because I want you to consider the youth that you work with, the youth that I've seen come in, teenage level. So many of the youth haven't had a sense of safety throughout their lives. So how do we expect them to make connections with people? How we expect them to connect with us if they've never really had a concept of safety and belonging? How do we expect them to kind of move up into the level of, you're seeing like esteem up there with confidence and self-esteem and achievement, and then moving on to the top level of self-actualization. I mean, so many complex subjects up there. You're talking about morality and creativity. um, it's pretty sad to kind of talk to a youth that is a really fantastic person, but they have no sense of safety and they have never been granted that privilege. So, how can they really explore how creative they can be? How can they really explore all the things that they have to contribute to our society? Um, so, this is a concept that I really encourage you to come back to and really start thinking about when you're thinking about the type of youth that you've spent time with and worked with. All the potential that we see in our youth, and a lot of it that can end up being wasted if they don't address these base level needs. I'm really interested in how hopeful this all is because of people like you. Um, when a good resource family comes in and starts developing these things, there really is not an age that it's too late to start developing a concept of safety. It might be very difficult for a teenager to conceptualize that when they haven't had the privilege of safety in their lives, just a general sense of self. But it isn't too late. We can help them explore that. Moreover, what does this all mean for us as we work with this population? And just reading off some of the statistics for you here and what you're seeing and why it's so important. You're talking about 40% of the kids that enter foster care with oral health issues, issues with the teeth, developmental issues that we're seeing with a large portion of the population. Um, no health insurance is something that we see quite a bit. We're lucky enough in California that there are resources out there that kind of help the youth in foster care to achieve that. But then even emancipated youth, as it talks in the middle there, chronic health and visual health and auditory impairments. What we're seeing from the probation standpoint is even though a lot of our youth, they have the resources now because the state is trying to provide them resources to kind of achieve higher education. Many of the youth, unfortunately, they don't have the drive to follow through with it, even though many of the financial barriers are being removed. Um, Consider what it takes to go to college, to be in that intimidating environment. I recall myself the amount of support I received from family, from my network of people. Um, it's just something that a lot of our youth, they don't have in general, and it's something that we can again build for them. So the effects here that we see and what we are doing to address those effects, and again, being in California, we're at a privileged position here. We've recently had kind of a major change in the way we do business, both at probation and at child welfare. It's called Continuum of Care Reform, CCR. It's very personal to me because it's something that created my position. And about 2016, a lot of these reforms took place. And the basic idea of the reforms to the system in California was that people started realizing for our youth, staying in the community gives them a tremendous advantage. Time was that a lot of our youth who weren't being able to succeed in our community were sent away to congregate care, to places like camps, group homes, things like that. And as well-meaning as these programs were, they didn't restore the youth, and they certainly didn't help the youth in the way they're fitting in with the families. So now there's an emphasis on family, an emphasis even through the process we put you all through, the new resource family approval process. It's attempting to kind of integrate you into a broader spectrum of trainings, a broader spectrum of education, and help the youth kind of see them from start to finish of the system. The bottom part, child and family teaming, is something I'm very involved with. I'm a facilitator for CFTs, child and family teams. We do a lot of child and family team meetings at probation, and I've trained a lot of people over at the Child Welfare Department and mental health. So there's a lot of qualified folks, and the point of this is taking family members and getting them involved and creating a team around the child so that that child can succeed later in life, and building a team that is constructed of people that will be there longer than the system will. Because once the system has exited the child's life, we need something to replace that. And if we have their own system constructed of people in their community, this helps those kids get what they're looking for. This is a silly video of one of our favorite dads, Homer Simpson, handling a situation with his son in a tremendously inappropriate fashion. So I want to play this video for you here and allow you to watch.
Okay, let's get started. Oh. Hey, wake up!
Oh, sorry.
Now read the first line.
I ate pee-pee. You little guy! You
Better or worse?
worse!
Better or worse?
Much better.
This is a good example of the limits of YouTube training. Normally this would be kind of a group discussion, but because we aren't able to offer this live, I'll be walking you through the questions and answers here. Obviously, this is not a healthy way to interact with the youth. But that does beg the question, why might someone like Homer consider this to be effective? And the answer is, in the moment, it probably is effective. Corporal punishment and punishment like this usually accomplishes the mission, which in the moment probably is to kind of silence a youth, to kind of avoid embarrassment. What Homer, I don't think, thinks of in this sense, and what people might not always consider, is that there are far-reaching implications to this, and that leads into the next question. And we're going to see it as we kind of move along to the training, but Bart is of an age, and we have a lot of youth of an age where their brain is going to start making correlations. It's like when I act out or when I express needs to a parent, I'm going to expect negative results. So a lot of our youth learn never to be vulnerable. A lot of our youth learn never to kind of reach out or to kind of have a bad day. It's something that isn't necessarily positive. It might be helpful to the parent in the moment. I have two 6-year-old boys. I can't say that my parenting is always 100% where it should be. And a lot of times it's very tempting to just kind of address the issue and not, because it takes a lot more work as we all know, to parent in a way that's nurturing and to parent in a way that engages the youth in a healthy way. Um, in a normal training, and this is my favorite part of a normal training with you guys, is to ask your personal experiences with youth that have been through a lot. With youth that have been through this type of trauma. I know there are tons of stories out there. You guys have the multitude of experiences. If any of you ever do a training, I would be the first one to sign up just because there's so much knowledge out there. So it is to my frustration that we aren't able to ask about your personal experiences and what advice you would give a parent like Homer who's dealing with so much of these things. You guys are a huge resource for us. And again, it's why we like to try and go to the foster parent breakfasts and other activities to engage with you and to ask you questions. There's so much knowledge out there, and you know, I am definitely interested in your personal experiences, and we learn a lot when we do trainings like this. So hopefully in the future we can offer this as a live training, perhaps, and to kind of get your answers to some of these questions. From a basic standpoint, we want to answer the question, what is trauma? And again, this is the APA, American Psychological Association. They define trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event. And I think that's very interesting when I was looking it up, because many of us would think of trauma as the event, but rather they define it as the emotional response to the event. So, and I think that's an important distinction because it's something to look out for, is that when our youth are acting out, they are responding to an event. When we talk about childhood traumatic stress, that's something that occurs when the adolescents are exposed to events or situations that overwhelm them, that they have trouble coping with. And it affects their ability to function and interact on a daily basis. And I know so many of you from talking to you see youth that seemingly can't handle day-to-day life, and that might have a lot to do with situations that have occurred in the past. And I know no one is better than you all at kind of helping them to kind of process their way through those things. Again, it's worth noting that the type of trauma our youth can go through is very similar to the type of trauma an adult can go through. Post-traumatic stress is prevalent in our community. It's prevalent in the youth that we deal with. I know we think of soldiers when we think of post-traumatic stress, but many of the youth that come through juvenile hall, many of the youth that come through the county systems, they've all dealt with major stressors in their lives. And so they're just as apt to deal with post-traumatic stress as a soldier, unfortunately. So this is a video that, again, is a good example of something that we would process as a group. And there'll be some group questions that I'll talk you through after the video. But basically, I want you to look at this video and kind of see and observe some of the changes that the young lady in the video goes through. And we'll start it off now.
Happy birthday to you.
Make a wish. Granny.
Hello.
Have you done your homework? Adam.
For a general strike.
Ready or not? Here it comes.
Violent clashes with live ammunition against.
Deserve to get shot.
Have a nice day at school.
Airstrikes on rebel position.
We are going to stay.
What's happening?
Go.
Heavy fighting in Richmond.
Where are we?
Rebel forces advance.
Daddy! Happy birthday to you. Make a wish, darling.
Obviously, a very emotional video, and really, in the group discussion in the live version of this training, we talk about different changes that we've observed in the video. Obviously, there's a war going on in the background, but this young lady is going through a lot. She's experiencing quite a bit, and a lot of the changes kind of range from very obvious changes and obvious things that she changes to her life that she's going through, but then some of the more fascinating changes from a trauma standpoint is the subtle changes and it kind of observing her reaction to stimuli throughout the video kind of gets to where she's almost not reacting to anything anymore. And that's a very trauma oriented response, and that it's almost that her body is kind of turning off so that she can cope with the day to day. And we see that in a lot of our youth. And again, it's unfortunate that we aren't able to kind of meet in a live version of this, because we could talk about some of the behaviors that you've seen and experienced from young people that you've worked with and had in your home. A lot of the information that we go throughout the duration of this training comes straight from this book. Dr. van der Kolk has a tremendous amount of experience dealing with trauma and was very involved in the early studies of trauma and has been for many years. He wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. It's very wide-ranging book. I actually have a copy, and I want to really make sure you know that I keep a copy here at Probation. I'm notorious about destroying books. I dog-ear pages, I write in the margins, but I, on purpose, kept myself from doing that while I read this very informative book, because I wanted to keep it in relatively good shape so that I could lend it out. So if anybody out there wants to borrow it, you're more than welcome. Just give me a ring or send me an email or whatever, and I could get it to you. There are a lot of interesting books about trauma, and really, I can make a list, but all you really have to do is type trauma into Amazon, and you could see. I mean, there's just so much to choose from. So I would encourage you to kind of seek out other literature. And if you're interested and don't have the ability to get your hands on some literature, and you're really looking to kind of up your education on things like this, please ask us, the Resource Family team. We can make that available to you. So. We will be kind of going through a lot of the knowledge that Dr. van der Kolk has to offer us here as we move forward. This is a YouTube video that I found where Dr. van der Kolk is actually speaking at a parenting and education conference here in California. If you don't have time to really go through the entire book, or you're just looking for kind of a synopsis, this video, it's a couple hours, but it really does. He talks a lot about trauma and the current system and describes kind of his research and how we came to view trauma as so important. And it really is interesting to kind of see that trauma hasn't, as a concept, hasn't been around forever. This is still a relatively new concept, and the experts are still discovering new things about trauma. But this video specifically on YouTube, check it out. I mean, it's very interesting. He's a really entertaining speaker, and you could tell he has a lot of knowledge in the subject matter. And so we're going to be going through some concepts that he discusses both in the video I mentioned before and in his book. And I'm not big on reading directly off the PowerPoint, but I do want to make sure I do justice to what he's saying. I pulled out some quotes from his various trainings and from his book that I just think are important to discuss here. And basically here he's talking about the people who you love as a child and those people betraying you or hurting you. And he describes it in very human terms as when you're hurt as a child, your relationships in the future become very complex throughout adolescence and into adulthood. It becomes hard to move away from those relationships. And he talks about people addressing trauma as almost a fear reaction, and that's how we think of it. Oh, he went through this, and therefore there's trauma. I love the way he discusses trauma, though, because he talks about the importance of love. And it's not just a romantic idea for him. For him, it's something very tangible. It's an important part of traumatic stress. And he also, I see at the end of this quote, mentions what he calls the stupid diagnostic system. He's definitely not against the system, and he's definitely not against medication. He calls both these things valuable tools, but he definitely feels that there are things that are left out. And I think that's probably something that you guys experience as well, is that if a youth that you're dealing with has a diagnosis, the system kind of tends to treat them as that's what they are now, where you understand that they're complex people dealing with complex issues, and no one is just a diagnosis or a symptom. So he is a harsh advocate for dealing with people in a complex way and dealing with them as complex human beings. He discussed the MRI studies that have been going on, and it was very interesting when he was discussing this. He actually discussed this on the video. He was talking about when people were actively recalling their trauma and having the MRI done, that major sections of their brain simply stopped functioning. And the word he used was people became dumbfounded. And that's the power of dealing with trauma. That's the power of what our youth have gone through and what they carry through to adulthood. This is actually something that's so impactful that sections of their brain are actively turning off. So you may see that someone going through something that we might consider mundane or minor, and all of a sudden they just react in a way that seems so extreme. But that trauma has a major effect on the brain, and that's something that the doctor talks a lot about. And he's discussing also some other types of ways to address trauma. Now, again, he's not anti-drug treatment, and he certainly says that there are ways that drugs can help and that prescribed drugs can be effective. And I know from my experience working with psychiatrists in our county, they're very hesitant to prescribe to our youth and to our adolescents. So, and then when they do prescribe drugs, they want to make sure it's prescribed carefully. But there are other methods as well, and Dr. Vanderkolk discussed a specific instance where he was asked to study yoga and the reaction of certain populations when that was instituted instead of drug trials, and he was talking about the positive results that he was seeing there. And really, for him, what this meant was that you can engage trauma yourself as a person, and that the youth that we're working with do have the power to talk about their trauma. They do have the power to deal with these things in a positive way, and we have the power to help them. He discusses mindfulness. I know that's something we discussed at the beginning with the breathing exercise. It's okay to attempt to teach our youth how to do that, but it is, as you go forward in the paragraph here, he talks about how excruciatingly difficult it is for traumatized people to be mindful, literally. And I know you've probably seen this, I've seen it, having a youth or an adolescent sit still, it's like they can't stand it. It's very difficult for someone that age, especially someone who's been through trauma. And the way he explains it is that they start paying attention to themselves and they start thinking about their trauma. And that is something that actively just kind of turns on in their brain when they aren't moving and when they aren't engaging. So that does explain a lot of why we're seeing our youth deal with drug use, why we're seeing our youth at such a young age deal with alcohol use. That's something to use to kind of calm their nerves, calm their senses when their senses kind of go haywire in moments of still or moments of quiet. The temptation becomes to treat the trauma as just kind of an event that happened. It just took place in the past, and it's something that people just have to get over. And really, from listening to Dr. Vanderkolk, this isn't the case, and he discusses it. The body continues to feel through this process of the mind, through trauma, that the traumatic event is currently happening. It's happening right now. And people who deal with this, their bodies are reacting as if they're going through trauma. currently. And that's how their brain has taught them to react. So it's a really complex emotional spectrum that they're dealing with. And for our youth, I mean, that's what they're going through. And we see a lot of behaviors that we might interpret as behaviors that are outside the norm, and they certainly are. But it might not be vindictive on their part. It might be something that they're dealing with at a real visceral level, like they're feeling like these things are happening to them right now. And the next quote here is something that I love that he said when he was talking about it, and I'm going to read it to you. Just as he said it. He said, "The trauma lives on in your body. Our challenge is to how do we help people to befriend their bodies, to love their bodies, to feel safe inside their bodies." And that's why he calls his book, The Body Keeps the Score. And that notion of helping people feel safe is really a simple notion. But as we know, and as you know, especially from the work that you do, it's a lot harder to help someone feel safe than it seems. It's a simple notion, but a very complex pursuit in practice. And I know that's something that you guys are experts at, and that you really strive to help youth feel safe in your home. So we applaud you for that, because again, without you, the situation would be even more dire than it is currently, because these youth in our communities, these community members, they need homes and they need a place to feel safe. And we appreciate you doing that for them. From a brain chemistry perspective, he uses the quote, "Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way the mind and brain manages perceptions." So trauma, in fact, reorganizes the brain. And that's obviously a very difficult thing to reverse. One of the things that we want to do, and rightly so, is kind of allow the youth and adolescents that we work with to talk about these things, to feel safe discussing them with us and with like therapists in a safe setting. Dr. van der Kolk says that this is helpful, and at the bottom there of this quote, he said it's profoundly meaningful for them, but usually not enough. What he talks about, and I think it's so well phrased, is he talks about for real change to take place, the body needs to learn that there is no danger anymore, that they can live in the reality of the present and not constantly being addressing the danger in their lives. For us to do anything, sit around and watch TV or hang out with family or even enjoy a meal. I mean, how many of those things could we possibly do if our body always feels like we're in danger? It would be very hard to function. No one understands this better than you all. It's extremely difficult to kind of help someone who has never had that kind of idea of safety in a real way, to help them feel safe and feel that they can interact with the world in a safe way is just so extraordinarily difficult. And it's, again, so admirable what you all do and how you all are able to help youth to feel that way. It's the most important job in the world. This is the next video here we have. It's just a very quick video on brain development.
By the time a human embryo is 5 weeks old, it is just the size of an apple seed, but the brain has already begun to grow. By 8 weeks, the basic structure of the brain and central nervous system are in place. The neural networks are spreading out, and even now the nerve signals are traveling more than 150 miles an hour. At birth, nearly all 100 billion neurons of the human brain are already in place, but the brain only weighs about 25% of what it will later on. It's about to embark on its fastest growing period, quadrupling in size by the time a child finishes preschool. By age 6, the brain is 90% of its adult size. During that burst of growth, 700 new neural connections are formed every second as we gain the capacity to smile around 2 months, to talk, usually around a year, and to dress ourselves around the age of 3. In those early years, in fact throughout our lives, the brain changes through experience, learning to speak, taking those first steps, understanding colors and shapes, forming novel thoughts. But as certain neurons are used more frequently, other unused neurons go away. It's a process called pruning. And almost anything can shape us in those baby and toddler years. First words, first ice cream, first TV show, first argument, for better or worse.
We begin to discuss trauma and the impact on brain development. We come back to Dr. van der Kolk with a great quote, I thought. He says, developmental trauma is where trauma meets attachment. So much of this, as he talks and discusses, is about early attachments that people develop and try to develop with people that are supposed to love them, and how difficult it is for someone to attach when that's not necessarily the case. It appears that from a lot of the early research into trauma that it would seem that many of mental health issues were the results of genetics, and that was sort of the explanation from a lot of the early science out there, that genetics produced a lot of mental health issues and concerns. The later research states that there's all sorts of experiences that can cause reactions to events. I'm going to get my little laser pointer out here, and you could see from this graphic, so a traumatic event occurs in this person's life. And there's all sorts of risk factors that might lead to something like post-traumatic stress. Some interesting things that you're seeing is, yes, there is a genetic concern, but there's also things like previous trauma. If you've been through previous trauma, it might make this trauma a lot more difficult to deal with. Lack of support is something that they also reference here. Neurological capacity, stuff that's already going on in your life. There are all sorts of things that make trauma a lot harder to deal with, and we should definitely be cognizant of that when we're working with our youth. Very interesting to start talking about brain development, especially when it comes to trauma. Just here in the upper paragraph, the concept of these neural connections called synapses comes up, and this isn't like a microbiology class or anything, but just kind of simply put, synapses organize the brain. They create pathways that connect the brain, and it kind of governs everything we do, sleeping to breathing, brain development, the more complex processes of the brain. At the bottom here, the bottom sort of part of the paragraph, right here, it talks about by the time children are 2 years old, the brain has developed approximately 100 trillion synapses, and this is more than we will ever need as adults. However, those synapses are eventually pruned out through experiences, as we've seen in that video. And so by the time children reach adolescence, about half of those synapses are discarded, and that leaves people with the number of synapses that they'll have for the rest of their lives. So in many ways, you can see how very important kind of early trauma becomes to brain development, because when many youth go through trauma and their brain and these synapses are connected in a way that's not as functional as it could be, that's something that many people have to deal with for the rest of their lives. The brain in many ways is very malleable when people are young, and it becomes less so when they grow up. So it's harder, but not impossible, to shed yourself of unhealthy habits. And I just want to talk about effects of the brain. This can get very technical. I know it's difficult for me, but I did want to highlight some different parts of the brain. And the first is the hippocampus, central to learning, central to memory. And as it says, stress and trauma can reduce the capacity to bring cortisol levels back to normal after a stressful event has occurred. Cortisol levels, of course, are crucial to dealing with stressful events. And if someone kind of has a kind of ongoing escalated level of cortisol, this can be very difficult to deal with. Corpus callosum, another part of the brain, dealing with emotion, arousal, cognitive abilities. They're talking about that this is the largest white matter structure in the brain. It's responsible for all sorts of communication processes, and it says up at the top that maltreated children have decreased volume in the corpus callosum. It doesn't allow them to deal with these things on as high a level as a person who isn't going through difficulties would. cerebellum, motor behavior, executive functioning, decreased volume as well for this if someone's been through trauma. So their motor skills become impacted. The prefrontal cortex is very important, as you can see here. Behavior, cognition, and emotional regulation all have to do with the prefrontal cortex. And it's saying in some studies on adolescents who've been severely neglected as children, this leads to them having a smaller prefrontal cortex. And as you'd imagine, when one has a smaller prefrontal cortex, they have trouble dealing with behavior, cognition, emotional regulation. I know that maybe this is something that you've seen in your own homes, kids having trouble, adolescents having trouble with these concepts. Sometimes it can be as a function of brain activity, which has been caused by trauma. The amygdala helps brain determine whether a stimulus is threatening. It triggers emotional responses. Abuse and neglect can cause overactivity in that area of the brain. So as you could imagine, when it's an overactive amygdala, you think everything is a threat. And we certainly have a lot of experience with that as well. This is the last slide in discussing brain function, after which I'm going to give your brain a break and let you watch a video here. But I do want to discuss cortisol levels. And as you see in the portion in red here, lower cortisol levels can lead to decreased energy, resources. It affects learning. It affects socialization. Higher cortisol levels could harm cognitive processes. And they talk about immune and inflammatory reactions as well. So we see that from studies that involve maltreated children who've been through trauma, there can be all sorts of effects on cortisol levels, and it can lead to all sorts of physical and mental consequences for having dealt with this type of trauma. The next video is from the movie Signs. It's actually a movie about aliens invading, and I know it sounds kooky to show you that, but it's just a really cool clip when it comes to dealing with trauma, because this family's actually going through having aliens come to Earth and dealing with that, but they've also already dealt with the loss of the mother in the family. And so I really would like you to observe kind of how they're reacting to the various levels of trauma they're going through and how each of the characters is dealing with it.
What's the matter with everyone? Eat.
Maybe we should say a prayer.
No,
Why not?
we're not saying a prayer.
Bo has a bad feeling. I had a dream.
We aren't saying a prayer. Eat.
I hate you.
That's fine.
You let Mom die.
Morgan. I am not wasting one more minute of my life on prayer. Not one more minute. Understood? Now, we are going to enjoy this meal. No one can stop us from enjoying this meal, so enjoy it! Stop crying!
Graham,
Don't yell at her!
All right. Since you're all not going to eat, I'm going to try some of everything.
I really enjoy that video for a number of reasons, and just kind of a lot of the observable ways that people can and do deal with trauma. Even healthy families deal with trauma. We're all dealing with trauma right now. This is a significant and unprecedented time that we live in. This is another example of a group activity that we would ask you to participate in the live offering. And this family is certainly dealing with trauma. And then you see the second question I ask there. What are some of the signs? And I'd say, get it. It's my dad joke because the movie is called Signs. But what are some of the signs you notice from this family dealing with trauma? And again, the entire family is dealing with this trauma, and the dad of sort of is reacting by kind of screaming at everyone, and then they get the kind of tantrumy version of trauma that the kid is I hate you type of thing, because the dad is supposed to keep people safe and the youth doesn't feel safe, and he's trying to communicate that. When you ask how they're coping, I don't know. I would say they're coping just fine. I mean, they're dealing with a lot. Losing a parent is of course a trauma that a lot of us can identify with. And that's a very significant trauma. And then getting attacked by aliens is also probably a very significant trauma. There are a lot of strengths in this family, and that's something that we would, of course, be discussing. There are a lot of strengths in a lot of people that deal with trauma, and that's one thing that I notice in the population that I work with is just how many strengths the youth that we work with have. And how much can be drawn out when we really take the time to communicate with them and work with them. So much of what we who work with youth are trying to achieve is regulation, allowing youth and adolescents to regulate their behavior in a way that's healthy. But we also have to make sure that we give them room to go through regular processes, allow youth to cry, allow them to express disagreement. It's more difficult than it sounds, especially with youth that have been through trauma. So we're looking through here, and we're seeing our pyramids again. I know we discussed Maslow before, but this is just different ways to look at the pyramids here, from a concept down here of survival. Then we go up to regulation, social and emotional, and cognition. I mean, as development goes, we go up the pyramid, and these are kind of different brain systems that we're working with here. And then you see the sort of traditional Maslow pyramid over here as well. The next part is another video that we had. It's discussing kind of how these connections are built throughout the brain, and I actually think it's a really hopeful video, and I'm looking forward to you seeing it here.
The emotional effects of childhood trauma are well known, but new scientific research reveals that a child's positive and negative experiences can shape and reshape the brain. Research suggests that the more a child witnesses violence, the more neural connections are created in regions of the brain that involve fear, anxiety, and impulsiveness, while fewer are created in regions that involve reasoning, planning, and behavioral control. The good news is the young brain is malleable or plastic, and fostering stable, supportive relationships can prevent or help reverse this damage, resulting in lifelong benefits for the child's learning, behavior, and overall health. So how can you help a child in your life? Just remember these 5 healing gestures. Celebrate them with a compliment or by applauding their efforts. Comfort them by staying calm and patient. Listen to them and show an interest in their passions. Collaborate with them by asking their opinions, and inspire them with new ideas. With these everyday gestures, you can help a child look forward to a bright future.
Pretty optimistic video there, I think, because it does demonstrate how malleable a brain can be and how much potential there is, especially for what we're discussing, early onset trauma. Things that our youth and adolescents deal with that can be addressed in a very positive way. There's so much potential in the human brain and so much we don't understand about it, but it does really seem like there's a lot of potential there to do well for our youth that we're dealing with. I wanted you to take a look at this study. It's a fairly comprehensive study, but it deals with emotional regulation in high-risk preschoolers. I highlighted a section for you at the bottom, which is really sort of the conclusion of the study, but it discusses the caregiver's sensitivity to the emotions that kids express and how important that is. Listening effectively to children when they're expressing sadness, not just treating it like it's some immature expression, but actively discussing that with them. Taking things seriously that children have to say. I know that's very difficult especially being adults and a busy adult. I know I, as a parent, sometimes don't take things my kids say as serious as I could, and that's something that I want to work on and utilize. It also discusses adults' emotional regulation and how regulated they are and how important that is to their children. Certainly, it's something that we can model for our kids moving forward. This next video here is it's a short little clip, but it is something that I want you to check out and see what you notice about this video.
Go back to the kitchen. Go back to the living room. It's already starting to get up.
So yeah, definitely. I think we've all been there, and it is important. You're watching a video like that. Again, it's important to consider, what is that youth asking for? What is he doing? I mean, he's obviously following them around, being very selective about where he tantrums, but it really does appear what he's asking for is attention. And I think you can choose to scold a youth like that, which could be or couldn't be a reasonable choice. I mean, or you can give the youth attention in a positive way and kind of demonstrate to him that you're not rewarding him for having the tantrum, but that you can provide attention. And I know someday it's very difficult kind of to deal with a kid who's going to tantrum like that. So, what can we do? Again, it's important for us to have realistic expectations for our children. They might not have the social, emotional, cognitive skills, and their coping behaviors might be very difficult for us to deal with. These behaviors are things such as being unable to control their emotions and their frequent outbursts, or they might go the other end of the spectrum and be quiet and submissive. Difficulties in school is something that we see quite a bit. Difficulties with education, cognitive difficulties, and then difficulties getting along with people in the family, such as siblings, classmates, people they spend time with. And this is a big one for kids. The kind of provocation that we're seeing. We saw it with the young man in that last video. And I don't know if he's someone who's dealt with trauma, but definitely someone who's trying to provoke something, provoking fights, even in a more serious case, soliciting sexual experiences. These are things to obviously look out for and to be very aware of, especially in your position. And then socially and emotionally inappropriate for their age, acting in a very, maybe in a more mature fashion than we think is age appropriate, or a more immature fashion, and being unresponsive to affection in a way that you think might be kind of a more normalized behavior. Addressing trauma together. So again, this is very difficult to do, and we wanted to kind of put it into practice in a discussion format. So we dealt with a youth we named Chris, and we came up with a story, and I'll read it to you now, and you can kind of consider how you would deal with this young man. Obviously, we can't do this. YouTube we're not able to do live, but we can certainly discuss it. So, 7-year-old boy who you have taken into your home. Chris' mother and father are heavily into drugs prior to pregnancy. Drug use continued, but mom said it wasn't that heavy while she was pregnant with Chris. Continued after he was born, though, and Chris is someone who spent long time of periods of time in isolation. I know my name is Chris, but this isn't my story. I just want to make that clear to everybody out there. This is just, we wanted to use a name, and we just picked this right out of a hat. Continued for 2 years until he was removed and placed in the grandparents' home. While his needs were met, was shown consistent affection, but Grandpa and Grandma grew frustrated with the situation and were very overwhelmed by such a fussy baby. This isn't out of the norm. This is something that we have seen with a lot of our young people. And then you ought to consider how important those first 2 years are and how big of an impact, and consider for what we've learned today, like what are those neural synapses like in this young person's brain? How have those developed, and in many cases not developed, to create a young person who in the first 2 years of life has now dealt with some difficulties that many haven't. Grandpa would often yell in response to any kind of negative behavior, and eventually Chris was again removed. And that's an important thing for regularity too when we're discussing it, is here's somebody who's been removed now from 2 homes. And what does that do to one's sense of safety? So removal from a series of relatives and foster homes remain an ongoing theme for this young man throughout his whole young life. Numerous issues of school, was labeled as disruptive, and had few peers who he felt close with, and only a few fights with other kids. And so then we're presuming that this young man is placed in your home, where he's quick to anger, defensive, and really kind of defensive of the biological parents. He's accusing you of trying to keep you apart from his parents, and having a hard time sleeping, scared of the dark. Sneaks into the hallway and falls asleep where he can hear adults speaking. So these are, again, you're starting to see, I think, with this development, things we've talked about that are clear indicators of trauma. Obviously, Chris has dealt with kind of a number of things coming up, and has a real hard time feeling safe. So the idea and kind of the live iteration of this training was to allow you to kind of process this and react and discuss, especially specifically, what are the resources available to you in our county to help deal with such a difficult case. Because that's the key, is to provide some sort of regularity to a young person who has dealt with almost none of it. I know a lot of the young people that we work with at probation have had stories kind of a lot like this, and it's heartbreaking to work with. But again, because of people like you in the community and because of the work that's being done, there is hope for a lot of these young people. And it's a hopeful time, and there's a lot of resources out there, but it does take a lot of patience. And again, I can't say it enough. We appreciate you for you playing such a big role in this. Another video, and it kind of takes you through a number of steps in the development, and provokes a lot of interesting ideas. So take a look at this video.
Adults often tell me I have an attachment disorder, but is this what's really going on in my brain?
It is actually only one part of a 7-piece jigsaw puzzle called developmental trauma. If you put this puzzle together, you can understand how my adverse childhood experiences have shaped my emotional world and behaviour you see.
Once you have taken the time to understand this, you can help me using something called the neurosequential model of therapeutics. It's not as complicated as it sounds.
It repairs my brain in a special order. But everyone who's part of my world needs to work together to make sure that I have the best chance to heal. This means home, school, therapy, and even my doctor needs to work together as a team. If you get this right, my developmental trauma can be repaired.
You have probably heard of attachment styles. Most people working with children and young people have. It's the way children's brains have developed to survive dangerous situations. By behaving in a certain way, we believe that adults around us will keep us alive.
But now, Dr. Patricia Crittenden has proved that children are even more incredible at surviving than we first thought. She has shown that we don't always stay in one attachment style. We change and organise our behaviour to make sure we can survive in the moment we are in.
In fact, I am so incredible at changing my behaviour to survive my different environments, it can be hard for you to believe what's really going on inside of me. I can be very good at school but break down at home, or unable to cope with school but be great at home.
We are starting to realise that not all grown-ups know about the 7-piece jigsaw puzzle called developmental trauma. A child who has had early life traumas will show symptoms. Developmental trauma is a set of profound problems in all areas of my development. It's not just older children who can suffer from developmental trauma. Babies can experience it too, even if they are removed from their mother at birth and placed in a safe new home. Any child who has lived in an environment where their trusted adults have not consistently met their emotional or physical needs, and any child who has suffered separation and loss from their family can suffer developmental trauma.
A psychiatrist, Bessel van der Kolk, has taught us that the 7 jigsaw pieces of developmental trauma includes somatic sensory issues in my brainstem, attachment, emotional regulation and behavioural regulation issues in my limbic brain, self-esteem issues, dissociation and cognitive problems in my cortical brain. If you want to support me, then you need to consider every single one of these jigsaw pieces.
Because I suffered early adverse experiences, my brain is not working the way it should. As my brain grew, the toxic environment I was in stopped it from developing in the way it should, essentially giving me brain damage. But with your help, my brain can be repaired. However, it needs to be done in the right order, using the right tools, with everyone working together as a team for this to happen.
A psychiatrist called Bruce Perry has developed a neurosequential model of therapeutics that helps us treat kids' brains in the right order, because even if you're the best, most amazing therapist in the world, if you start in the wrong time and place, it won't work. Brain develops from the bottom up. First, the brainstem grows. This is where my motor and sensory input is found. Secondly, my limbic brain grows. This is where my attachment, emotions and behaviour are held. Third is my cortical brain. This is where I do my thinking, inhibiting and learning. The job of my primitive brain, the brainstem, is to keep me safe. It is the part of me that keeps me alive. This was extra important when I was in a dangerous environment. It sent me into fight, flight or freeze, whatever I needed to survive. The problem is my brain got stuck there, so now I am safe. I can't switch my primitive brain off. I am always in survival mode. My everyday life still feels dangerous. Because I am stuck here, not much can get past it up to the other areas of my brain. This means that I find it really hard to form deep relationships, manage my emotions and behaviour, think and learn and understand.
I am simply trying to stay alive. I am stuck in a survival loop. I am hyper alert to danger. I experience life as normal cues or danger cues. I go into fight, flight, freeze continuously. I cannot take in nurture or information to make sense of cue. So my brain has developed from the bottom up. The higher parts of my brain are not getting the right messages. Importantly, if I'm stuck in the primitive brain, I will not be able to learn, no matter how good my teacher is. A proper assessment can show us whether a child needs support to develop their brainstem, their limbic brain or their cortical brain. Different therapies are good for different parts of the brain. Not all children need to start at the bottom in the brainstem.
It is also important to stay flexible when treating developmental trauma. For example, a child could be well regulated and working on attachment in their limbic brain, but then they might have a big change happen in their life. They might move to secondary school or perhaps have a bereavement. This may trigger a brainstem response for a few weeks or months. This means they might need a different focus in therapy to help them get regulated again before they can start thinking and connecting in their limbic brain again. The ideal is that the child and the therapy moves with a little bit of fluidity between the different brain regions, but only does reflective stuff in the limbic and cortical brain if the child is safe and regulated. So what does this knowledge mean? How can the different grown-ups in my life work together to help repair my brain? 1. Everyone needs to understand developmental trauma.
2. Make sure every environment in my life is stable.
3. Make sure your most trusted adult is supported and nurtured. If home is not safe, nothing else will be effective.
4. Look after my trusted adult. Their brain is my safe place. If they are okay, over time it will calm my fear.
5. Start in my brainstem. I cannot process conversations until my primitive brain has been repaired. If you try, I will fail and you could make things worse as my brain is trying to do something it isn't capable of at the moment.
6. Normal parenting doesn't work. My parental care will need to parent me therapeutically and will need support doing this, so they can teach me how to regulate my world and I can learn to feel safe in that relationship.
7. If I'm stuck in my brainstem, the treatment needs to be patterned and repetitive. I need my fear response calmed and to reattune in my important relationship. This sensory work needs to be done first before I can process any type of therapy.
8. Retraining my brainstem will take time. I need consistent, predictable, patterned and very frequent brainstem activities before you can expect me to think, learn and reflect. Changing my whole brain will take persistence and time.
9. Each part of my world needs to be working on the same place. Brain repair bottom up. Home, school and therapy need to understand which part of the brain they are working on and doing it together.
10. Arrange my world according to my brain age, not my birth age. Responding to my developmental age will be more effective in the moment than assuming my chronological age is the way to approach me.
11. I'm unique. A proper trauma-informed psychological assessment will tell you where I'm stuck and the best place to start my treatment.
12. Help me as early as possible. If you can start working on my brainstem, the moment I am safe, it will help my brain repair faster and mean I don't have to grow up experience the pain of my brain injury.
13. Like you, I'm a complex being and I need every part of my world working together to help repair my brain. You must work together for any work that is being done to be effective. If you want me to meet the separate milestones in my different worlds, schools, homes and therapy, you must all be working using the same approach.
14. Be a safe, healthy, caring and consistent adult. We are all designed to exist together as close communities. I need you.
At Beacon House, I'm supported and surrounded by a team of people, all working from the same place. home, school, therapy, and my wider support network of family and friends.
Relationships heal relationship trauma.
Now you understand how a scientific approach to healing can make a real difference to me. What can you do differently to help?
How can you change my future?
So that video is definitely just kind of a nice summation of everything we've gone over today. Really want to say thank you for taking the time to participate in this training, and thank you for all that you do. What you're dealing with and what you're doing is probably one of the most difficult things in the world, and I don't think I'm saying too much to say that. It's heroic, and we certainly appreciate it, and we want to provide you all the support we can. So please reach out to us if you have ideas about a training or something that you would like to see. This is kind of our first attempt to put something together specific to our population for YouTube and to make it easier for you to get some training in this way. I would love, because this is my first shot at it, I would love to get your guys' ideas and thoughts. And yeah, if you're looking to have any other kind of training that we could set up, we'd really appreciate your feedback. So again, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy, and appreciate it. And please check out the links too attached to this YouTube video as far as people you can contact. And again, please reach out to us. We want to be a support network to you. And again, we so appreciate what you do. Thank you very much, and have a nice rest of your day.